6 feet apart, 6 feet apart. It's the newest thing to do. Stay 6 feet apart, 6 feet apart. The distance between me and you. 6 feet apart, 6 feet apart. And when I say I'll keep you very close to my heart, it's purely metaphorical. These times are quite historical. So step aside, let's live our lives 6 feet apart.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to 6 Feet Apart Productions. And we are bringing you this program tonight in association with the Storytelling Association of California. Now, this is the second in the series of Stories in Living Color. And we're honored that we got to work with SAC and with all the storytellers tonight. And we really hope that you enjoy them. They're incredibly talented storytellers. And what they're trying to do is bring, systemic racism to the fore. Regina and I, at 6 Feet Apart, have been committed to amplifying voices of colour and to try and, bring all this to light, and so we can heal and maybe try a different way of being. We can only hope, can't we? Now we've got two other programmes, actually, if you're interested, that deal with the Black Lives Matter movement. So one is called Stories in Black and White, which is a very similar programming to how we're doing it tonight. Two storytellers that workshop their stories, and then there were some question and answers. And then there's just stories, which is called Black Stories Matter. So if you're interested in those, they're free on our YouTube channel. So thank you. We're really, really grateful that you bought tickets and are supporting our storytellers. And if you feel inclined, got a bit of extra cash, and you want to give it, please go to the Storytelling Association of California page, which is StorySAC, that's SAAC.org. And I'll put the link into the YouTube chat and into the Zoom chat. So feel free to go there if you want to give a bit of extra money. But now I'm delighted to welcome the brains and the driving force behind this series. He has worked tirelessly. I can't tell you how much. It is a bit like herding cats to do this, to get this idea up and running. And he's on the board of directors of the Storytelling Association of California. So please welcome Mr. Rick Roberts.
Thank you, Claire. This Stories in Living Color event, like the first one, pairs up black and white tellers. Our goal is to expand this theme to people of all colors and all communities, to include Asian, Latinx, Native American, LGBTQI, and other marginalized communities, with the focus on learning about racism and prejudice from the words of storytellers and their experiences. If you are a storyteller from any marginalized community, or you know one, please go to the Storytelling Association of California website to find out how to join this project. Where it eventually takes us will be determined by the storytellers who take part in it, the diversity of the storytellers and their experiences. The stories themselves will lead the way. And while we who hear these stories and the discussions about the stories may learn a lot from them, the learning begins with the tellers themselves, working together over a period of time as they craft their paired stories. The stories that we hear tonight are the result of this process. For those of us who are white, it is our responsibility as white people to talk to each other about white privilege in order to help end racism. There is no substitute for that. All of us need to remember the victims of state-sponsored racial violence and continue to name them and do our part to put an end to racial violence. We must demand justice and accountability. And those of us who make up the storytelling community, perhaps because we are storytellers, we can move things along just a little bit quicker by working together, by naming our own experiences, our fears, and even our shortcomings, and sharing these things through stories and discussions as we are doing tonight. And now, please welcome the MC for tonight's event, Kirk Waller. Kirk is a nationally recognized storyteller and the director of storytelling at Stagebridge in Oakland. Kirk?
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Claire, and welcome, everyone. I'm really looking forward to tonight. I tuned in last week, and if you did wow, it was really wonderful seeing the launching of these living colors, these paired storytellers, people from different cultures actually coming together and sharing their experiences and seeing where their stories might connect or where they might be a little bit different. And I think that everyone here would probably agree that we are in such a unique and interesting time in our history that this is a perfect timing for something like this. A time where it seems like we're at a cultural crossroads and we can make a decision to either go forward or go backwards. And there is no better avenue than using storytelling and dialogue to help understand each other. So I'm really looking forward to it. Last week's stories were great. I got a preview of this week's stories and they are just as amazing. And something really interesting that you're gonna see, if we were to put a title to tonight, I think it will be something like Through the Eyes of a Child, because that is one thing that all these stories do have in common. And those are the times that our impressions of the world are shaped. And I think it's just a great way to frame this evening. A couple of things I want to make sure we do right off the top is welcome what we call our backstage pass audience. Could we wave to our backstage audience? Audience, wave to everyone else. So this is like backstage. So these folks, they get to have a backstage, kind of rub elbows with the storytellers, or kind of rub Zoom screens, rub YouTube screens. We get to be together, and they get to be back here and hang out with us. And we also have our wonderful YouTube audience, which is tuning in as well. And so we want to welcome you to the show tonight. Here's how it's going to look. So as you know, it's called paired storytellers. So we're going to have two sets of two storytellers that you're going to hear, and they're going to tell a little bit. You're going to hear how they work together, and you're going to hear their stories. And then at the end of that time, we're going to open it up to you, our audience, to ask questions. So, you know, a lot of times when you're hearing stories or you're at a show, you're wondering things, and you're wondering, what about this? Or tell me a little bit more about that in your story, or how was it to work together? What was your experience like? So you get to ask questions. Now, two things about that I want to make sure I let you know. Make sure you ask the questions in the chat, and then they'll be sent over to me to ask the storyteller. We'll bring everybody back on. And then the other thing I need to let you know about that is, if you're anything like me, you're not going to remember the questions at the end of 4 stories. So feel free to send the questions over when they come up. Especially if there's something burning you want to know, go ahead and send that over at the time. We just won't address it until the end of the show. So I just want to make sure I give you that out. You can ask the questions at any time. So I think we're ready to jump on in. So let me get ready to introduce the first 2 set of storytellers. The first one is Terry Stokes and Ben Tucker. So you're going to hear from them in just a moment. Let me tell you a little bit about Terry. I have had the pleasure of actually knowing Terry. Didn't plan it that way, but I happen to know him pretty well. Been close to like a decade or so, known through Stagebridge, but he has been telling stories for quite some time. And before he started telling stories, he actually had a 30-year career in Hollywood as a film editor. So stories are in this man's bones. He's taken acting, storytelling, musical workshops. He's joined Never Too Late at Stagebridge, and you'll find his storytelling probing, delightful, and just wonderful. And you're also going to hear from Ben Tucker in a few moments after Terry. And Ben, or Brother Ben, I didn't plan it this way, happen to know this young man too. Ben has been telling stories for quite some time, and he is an actor and he's an author. I read his book, really, really good. And he's performed in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's performed at Stagebridge and well beyond that. His stories are drawn from folk tales, historical characters, and his own personal experience. I don't know if someone could put this in the chat, but if you want to know a little bit more about Ben, you can look up iambentucker.com. And so that's enough from me. Let's go ahead and open up and hear from these wonderful storytellers. Let's welcome our first storyteller, Terry Stokes.
Thanks, Kirk. Come on, Terry. Come and eat your breakfast. I knew what I would see when I finally came out of my bedroom in response to my mother's call, she'd be leaning in the doorway to our kitchen located at the end of a long, narrow hallway in our New York City apartment. Standing where she always stood on school mornings, cigarette in hand, waiting with as much patience as she could muster before issuing her second call, the call that I knew was sure to come. Terry, come on now, your breakfast is getting cold. You're going to be late for school again. The year was 1944. I was 7 years old and I was a dawdler. I still am to some degree. You can just ask my wife. But I could always find much more important and entertaining things to do in my room than in my classroom. But reluctantly, I bolted out of the door, dashed down the hall toward my mother, and whipped through the doorway to the kitchen and put on the brakes. There, seated at our breakfast table, was a complete stranger, a big stranger, an enormous giant of a man. And he was already eating out of my Captain Midnight cereal bowl. And it wasn't just his size that stunned me. It was the color of his skin. You see, he was black. Shyly, I retreated to my mother's side and I peeked out from under her swollen belly where my soon-to-be sibling floated peacefully upside down in amniotic bliss. Terry, this is Alan Blake. Can you say hello? Hello. Alan has come to help us clean up this apartment. The people who lived here have left it dirty and messy, and we want to get it all cleaned up spick and span for when your baby brother or sister arrives now, don't we? The giant was looking at me with a smile, the biggest smile I'd ever seen. All I could see at first was an array of gold teeth in his mouth. I was frightened a bit, but at the same time, I was mesmerized. He was clad in old faded coveralls, you know, the kind with the straps that go over your shoulder and have little metal clips that fasten in the metal buttons in front. And he wore a bright white tank top undershirt that accentuated his massive chiseled physique. It seemed to me that he was bigger and stronger than any of my favorite superheroes of the day. I mean, Batman and Superman weren't even in the same league with this man. And his skin seemed to exude an ebony light, which was only exceeded by the sparkle and twinkle in his eyes. Now, here's a little backstory to this tale, some context. As you may have already surmised, my mother was born in the South. In fact, both my mother and father were born in the South. My mother was born in the small town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of Fort Bragg. And my father was born in an even smaller town in the southern part of Georgia, the most southern part of it, a town called Moultrie. Up until this time, my only experience with people of color had come in the summertime when my mother and I visited my mother's mother, my grandma Mamie, and her two sisters, my great aunt Helen and my great aunt Lil. All three of those sisters lived in another little small town in North Carolina called Black Mountain. I knew that a colored woman by the name of Hattie came to my grandma's house every day but Sunday to help her with the cleaning and the cooking. That was incidentally how the three sisters referred to their hired help. They called them the coloreds. Whenever it was time to eat, Hattie always served us first and then sat alone in the kitchen to eat her meal. Likewise, at my grand aunt Helen's house, it was Effie May who did that kind of work for her. And there were many, many more colored people helping my grand aunt Lil with her much bigger house and her much greater needs. But these colored people never, ever were invited to sit down and have a meal with any of us. I recall one day when Hattie brought her daughter Lavinia over to Grandma Mamie's house. Now, she was a few years older than I was, but we got along really well and played great together. When it came time to have lunch, I raised such a fuss and cry about not having Olivia being allowed to sit at the table with me that Mamie finally relented, unfolded a card table, and placed it in the far corner of the dining room. And we two children were then allowed to have a picnic together. albeit, as I now realize in retrospect, a picnic in the segregated corner of the dining room. When we went into town, and I went in with my mother and grandmother, I noticed the signs over the water fountain that read white only, and signs over the restrooms at the train station that said no colored allowed. But I didn't question this. I was a child and I've never seen anything like that in New York City. So I think I must have assumed and believed that that was just how it was in the town of Black Mountain. Go on, Terry, now go over and sit down with Alan and eat your breakfast. The giant man named Alan Blake kept his high beam smile focused on me as I crossed the room, jumped up in my chair and took a seat across from him and began, with my eyes shyly averted, to wolf down my cream of wheat cereal as fast as I could shovel it in. Mrs. Stokes, he's a very handsome boy. He's gonna grow up to be a fine young man someday. I'm telling you in advance. Alan was from Jamaica, and his deep basso voice had a totally different timbre to it than the sounds of the South that I was familiar with. Yes, we think so too, Alan. Terry, Alan just paid you a very nice compliment. Can you say thank you? Yes, thank you. Okay, Mom, can I go to school now? Wait a minute, young man. You must finish your milk first. He's right, Terry. We do have a problem with him, Alan, on that score. Come here, Terry. Sit up here on Alan's knee. And he reached out with a massive hand and plucked me from the ground like I was a piece of lint and placed me up on one of his gigantic thighs. And then he raised his right arm and pointed to his bicep. Put your hand on this muscle, boy. Now, just for the sake of scale, imagine a baby's hand trying to palm a large grapefruit. I placed my hand on his bicep and it suddenly came to life and miraculously jumped to twice its original size. My eyes popped and pulled my hand away. Ha! That's the magic of milk, boy. You drink your milk every day. You have muscle big and jumpy just like Alan. I put my hand back on his bicep for several more demonstrations of the magic of milk, hopped down off his knee, crossed over to my seat, picked up my glass, and finished mine. Now, no man ever worked harder than Alan Blake. During the day, he tirelessly scoured and cleaned with all manner of devices and detergents, climbed up and down ladder to get to every nook and cranny of that old apartment building with its high ceiling moldings. That apartment was heated with coals, so there was soot and coal dust everywhere. But I actually saw him take a toothpick and Q-tips and go into some of those corners in order to get them clean. And when he finished his cleaning, I am absolutely sure that open heart surgery could have been performed at that apartment building, our apartment at 118 East 18th Street. He did this work for us twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And it always took him 2 days to complete the job. Because he lived in Harlem on the Upper West Side of the city, and he had no car, the commute to our apartment was a long and arduous one, requiring many subway and bus transfers. So my parents insisted that Alan stay overnight with us in our guest bedroom. And each evening when my father came home from work, we all sat down at the dinner table to eat together. We held hands, and Alan always said grace. I don't remember now the words he spoke, but I do know that they were meaningful. They were devout and sincere, not so much about scripture, but more about family and gratitude for the bounty that we were about to share together. My father was never a man who was afraid to show his emotions, and on more than one occasion, I do recall him tearing up as we all squeezed hands and said, Amen. Now, as fate would have it, very soon after my baby brother was born, my grandma Mamie came north from Black Mountain to visit us and, more importantly, to meet her newest grandson. She arrived on the same day that Alan began his fall cleaning. I remember running into the kitchen, expecting to greet my grandmother, expecting to get a big warm hug and words of praise for how big I was getting, especially my little biceps. But a child always knows when something's wrong. I immediately felt the tension in that room like a dark, heavy, thick fog. Mamie was stirring some cream into her coffee, and my mother was explaining to her that Alan would be spending the night with us and eating his meals with us. Mamie's spoon froze in her cup, and she said she wouldn't hear of it. And a low whispered argument ensued throughout the day between mother and daughter. When my father came home, Mamie changed her tactics and immediately assailed him, hoping that a saner mind from the deepest region of the South and a more conservative region, that his voice would prevail. But when he reaffirmed my mother's position, Mamie became apoplectic. She raised her voice to almost a shriek. Now, you children listen here, and you listen good. I will not sit down at this table with any other damn table for that matter and eat my meals with any goddamn near mother, Mamie. You stop right there. Now, I had never heard my father raise his voice to anyone, much less to his mother-in-law, a very powerful matriarchal force in that family, to whom he always showed such deference and respect and loving demeanor. So we were all stunned in absolute silence. He lowered his voice and went on. Mother Mamie, you know that I'm as devoted to you as I am to your daughter, but I will not permit the use of that word in this home. You know we love you, that you're always welcome here to eat our meals and reside with us as long as you please. But Alan Blake is as much a part of this family as you are, and we will not treat him any differently than we treat you. Mamie stormed from the kitchen and made a phone call to my Uncle Neil, who happened to live in the same apartment building, but up on the 6th floor of the East Wing. And she made arrangements to stay the night with him and my Aunt Martha. It was an old apartment building. That apartment building was over 100 years old and was at that time the oldest apartment building in New York City. So it had no elevator in it. So Mamie had to walk up 6 steep flights of stairs in order to stand her ground, which was no small feat for a 63-year-old woman with a bad hip. My father, ever the Southern gentleman, carried her 2 heavy suitcases up those stairs for her, gave her a dutiful kiss on the cheek, told her he loved her, and said goodnight. There was several more occasions when Mamie came to town when Alan was with us. Each time she chose to stay in a hotel and would go on to the extended members of our family about how my parents had ostracized her and cast her out. But my parents held their ground, and I never heard the N-word ever spoken in our home. Over the years, I came to understand that Alan worked for many people in New York City, like my parents. And because of his reputation, which had spread by word of mouth, he was able to put his 2 daughters through college. My parents contributed annually to a fund that he had established for their education. Both girls graduated with honors. One of them became a professor of anthropology at Hunter College in New York City. The other became a doctor of pediatric medicine at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Over the years, occasionally, Alan invited us up to his apartment in Upper Harlem, his tenement apartment. And you could tell how proud he was of his girls and all of their accomplishments. And it was always fun hearing Alan and my father sharing stories of their childhood together. Fishing stories mostly. My father fishing the rivers, Alan fishing the sea. And the food his wife prepared for us was delicious and unusual, with exotic flavors and spices and aromas that we had never, ever experienced before. Time passed, and I went away to college. Alan had aged to the point where he couldn't climb the ladders or do the long hours of work that he once did. When I was 23, I learned that my grandmother, Mamie, had been diagnosed with lung cancer and would need a serious operation that would likely require a blood transfusion. Alan went to the hospital and donated his blood for her. He was an O-negative universal donor. My mother never told Mamie about it. I'm sure she felt that Mamie would die of shock right on the spot if she ever thought that Alan Blake's blood might be flowing through her veins. She died after a prolonged illness, with my mother nursing and caretaking her for her right to the very end. Alan passed away a few years later. My father was a singer, and he made a living as being a singer. He started his career with the Metropolitan Opera Company. His last gig was with the Mitch Miller Gang on the Sing Along with Mitch show, television show. Sadly, he used to get hate mail from old friends and classmates and even members of his own family, chastising him for his willingness to perform with Leslie Uggams, the very talented Black vocalist who was featured on that show. My father never answered those letters with the same kind of vitriol and venom that he had received. Instead, he answered each one of those letters saying that Leslie Uggams was as talented as any singer he had ever performed with in his entire career, including some of the top divas he had sung with at the Met. I had the opportunity of meeting her once when I was home from college, and I saw that same spark of good soul and strength of character in her eyes that I had seen in Alan Blake's. I often wonder what Alan and my parents would think of our world today. It appears that some of the chains of racial hate and bigotry are weakening and falling by the wayside. I, for one, along with many others, am profoundly grateful that Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, and more significantly, re-elected for a second term. Because now the precedent has been established. We can have another Black president in our future. How about perhaps a woman president someday? How about a Black woman president? How about a Jew, a Latino, a Muslim, a Navajo? How about the most qualified person to do the job and climb the ladders and do the hard work? But we still have a long, long way to go. The evidence of the last 4 years has proven that to me beyond a doubt. Systemic racism is all too alive and well in our divided country. The Black Lives Matter movement and the diversity in the crowds that I've witnessed on television, those crowds protesting against random and unconscionable police violence, give me glimpses, little glimpses and glimmers of optimism. But I will always be grateful to my parents for doing their part in weakening those chains, and for that pivotal moment in our kitchen in 1944, when Alan Blake and I sat down and shared our first meal together and became friends. For me, that was the magic of milk.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. I've been thinking about that statement a lot, especially now with racial injustice and everything that's going on in this country now. And those thoughts took me back to my early childhood. In fact, my first childhood memory took me down memory lane. So why don't y'all come with me back down memory lane, and I'll tell you about my thoughts. I'm on a train, sitting on a hard bench in a crowded, smoky, hot coach that's hitched to the engine of the train. And I'm sitting with my parents and my two sisters, and we're facing backwards, looking directly into the next coach. And that coach, it's not crowded. It has ceiling fans. It has curtains. and it has people walking leisurely up and down the aisles. Let's go sit back down there, Mama. It's hot in here, I say. She shushes me. Hush, boy. We can't sit back there. Why? My sisters, they chorus in too. Why? Because that's the coach for white folks. We sitting in the colored folks' coach. That's not fair, I say. My sisters chime in again. Yeah, Mama, that's not fair. Hush, children. I done told y'all to be quiet. She gives us that hard look that only mamas can give. We sulk. We look down. And then her face softens and she leans in and says, I know it ain't fair, children. It ain't fair. That's why we leave in Louisiana, this Jim Crow state. We going to California to join your father. He got a job out there and a house in San Francisco, and it ain't no Jim Crow out there. No, children, ain't no Jim Crow out there. The year was 1946, and I was 3 years old. We joined my father in San Francisco. We moved into the public housing projects that were built especially for the shipyard workers. My father was a welder, and we lived in the Dog Patch neighborhood in San Francisco on the southeast side of the city along the San Francisco Bay shoreline. And Dog Patch was a gritty, semi-industrial neighborhood. It's gentrified now, but there was nothing but projects and ramshackle houses and a whole lot of industry. While the neighborhood was populated with shipyards, freight train yards, we had a fire station right up the street from us, and we had a slaughterhouse. And on Tuesdays, that was cow killing day. And you talk about stink, we call it Stanky Tuesday. It wasn't Stinky Tuesday, it was Stanky Tuesday because it would stink to high heaven on Tuesdays. And on Tuesdays morning, sometimes on our way to school, sometimes we could see runaway cows that had gotten out of the chute when they were being unloaded. And they would be running up 3rd Street. And on their tails were a couple of guys on horseback with lassos trying to rope them. And boy, it was rodeo on 3rd Street. It was an exciting place, Dog Patch. Now, my school was about 5 or 6 blocks from there, Irvin M. Scott. And it was a school that was predominantly Black. I would say 95% Black with a few white kids and a few Mexican kids. And my first 4 years of school was pretty much unremarkable. But then in the 5th grade, I was selected to be a traffic boy. I was a crossing guard, and that gave me status in the school. And in the 6th grade, I was promoted to be the captain of the crossing guard by Ms. Owens, our principal. Now, let me tell you about Miss Owens. Miss Owens was a large white woman with like bluish, whitish hair. And she wore her glasses with a chain around them. And when she wasn't reading, the chain would hang around her neck. She was a disciplinarian, a no-nonsense woman. And she did not suffer fools well. Everyone was afraid of her, but I wasn't, because Miss Owens liked me. I was the principal's pet. And not only did she promote me to be the crossing guard, but she gave me the honor of raising and lowering the flag before and after school. And she gave me a lecture on how to handle the flag and how to make sure it was very, very well protected and respected. And she told me, Ben, one of the things you do is never let that flag touch the ground. So many people have died, Black, white, you name it. So keep that flag off the ground, whatever you do when you lower it down, and fold it up in a nice triangle. And she had the custodian show me how to do that. And in addition to that, I would go and fetch her lunch every day. She ate the same thing every day: cottage cheese and a can of sliced peaches. So I was really, 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 really pleased and proud of myself. My mom was very, very proud. Oh, I'm so glad you volunteering at the school and getting kids straight across the street and back. My father, how much you get paid, boy? Daddy, I don't get paid nothing. He's volunteering, Benjamin, my mother would say. Volunteering? Black folks don't need to be working free for nothing. Slavery over, boy, you better get a paying job. She said, Benjamin, let the boy volunteer. So I did. Even though it wasn't a paying gig, it was a serious gig because there was a lot of traffic in and around our school. Cars and trucks and trains. Several kids had got hit by cars on their way to school or going home. One boy was hit by a car, another one was hit by a truck, and one kid was even hit by a lift fork. So it was very, very important that students followed the rules and regulations in the school when it came to traffic safety. And if not, you'd be written up on a detention and have to work after school and do all kind of volunteer work and work for the custodian too when he cleaned up. So I was happy. Things were going good for me. I was California dreaming. And then one day, as I was working the corner of 22nd and 3rd Street, Eddie Zeno jaywalked in the middle of the intersection. And I immediately blew my whistle. Hey, you, get back on that sidewalk and cross in the crosswalk. Now, I got to tell you about Eddie. He was one of the few white kids in our school. And Eddie was tough. And his brother was a welterweight champ in the city when it came to amateur boxing. They called him the White Sugar Ray Robinson. Nobody wanted to fight Eddie Zeno. Black kids and Mexican kids, he was the toughest kid in school. But I was the captain of the crossing guard. And I said, get back. He turned around and leered at me. You talking to me? I'm talking to you. Who do you think you are? I'm the captain of the crossing guard. Ha! You look like a smokestack to me, you fucking nigger. No, he didn't. The kids on the corner, they howl. Woo! I am stunned. No one has ever talked to me like that in my entire life. You are in trouble, Eddie. I'm going to tell Miss Owens on you. We're going to write you up. You're going to be detained. He turned around, looked at me, and gave me the finger and walked off with a swagger, laughing. The kids say, you're going to let him get away with that? I said, he's in trouble. You watch. Going to tell Miss Owens on him as soon as I get you guys off this corner. I left the corner early. I stormed up to the school, barged into her office, straight past the secretary. I'm hyperventilating at this time. Miss Owens, Eddie Zeno. I run the whole story down to her. She takes her glasses off. She looks at me. I want a detention slip. We got to write him up. He called me bad names and he crossed in the middle of the crosswalk. I got all kinds of witnesses. She says, okay, Ben, I've heard enough. I said, okay, give me the detention slip so I can write up the report on him. I'll handle that, Ben. What? I'll handle that. Now, I had written up at least 10 or 15 detention slips. All of them were for black kids. And it clicks. Eddie Zeno's a white kid. But Miss Owens, we wrote Jimmy Lee up and he didn't even call me any names. All he did was cross in the jaywalk. Ben, I said, I will handle this. Now go take the flag down. I turn around. I'm totally deflated. My head's down, chin on my chest. I slowly walk to the door. She says, Ben. I stop, but I don't turn around. Tell it to the back, I think. Ben, if you want to continue to be the captain of the crossing guards, you need to develop thick skin. And that's all I heard when I walked out that room. Thick skin, thick skin. I walked to the flagpole. I slowly lowered the flag to the ground. And before I know it, the flag was on the ground. But it didn't matter to me anymore because I had lost all respect for Miss Owens and that flag. Because I saw Jim Crow sitting right up in that room in the form of Miss Owens. And I was back on that train, y'all. Back on that train. I picked the flag up and walked over to the steps of the school. I sat on those steps and I decided right then and there, I'm gonna quit. I took off my traffic boy cap, took off the belt, pulled off my badge. I didn't fold the flag up in the neat triangle that I was taught. I put all that gear in the flag, balled it up, walked in her office past the secretary, laid it on the table. I said, I quit. Walked out before she could say a word. On the way home, it occurred to me, what am I going to tell my mother? She's so proud. But then I remembered I had a friend, Isaac Terry. And Isaac sold newspapers, and he'd been telling me, man, you need to start selling papers. They got a corner open up on 16th and 3rd, and you can make big money. So I went to 3rd and Army where Isaac sold his newspapers. And I asked him, I said, Isaac, is that position still open? I want to sell newspapers like you, man. He said, yeah, come on out tomorrow and we'll get you started. I'll hook you up with the paper man. And so I went home. And that night over dinner, I broke the news to my parents. Mama, Daddy, I quit the traffic boy crossing guard job. My mother gasped, what? What? What are you talking about? I said, I want to sell newspapers, Mom. I want to make some money. My father jumped right. That's right, boy. You need to get out there and make some money. Quit working for them white folks for free. When do you start? Tomorrow. Good. So the next day, I started selling newspapers on 16th and 3rd Street, right across from the shipyard. And when that 5 o'clock whistle blew, woo, the shipyard workers would come pouring out of the shipyard, and I was selling papers left and right. Extra, extra, read all about it. And I got good tips, and I had jingle in my jeans. I was doing so well that I bought myself a new swing bike. Everything was going great for me. And I had totally forgot about Miss Owens. I forgot all about Eddie Zeno. So I got promoted from the 6th grade with the rest of my class, and we all went to school on Potrero Hill, about another 4 or 5 blocks from my old school. Eddie Zeno, he was part of that crew too. But I kept my distance from Eddie in junior high school, just like I did my last year of elementary school. And Eddie continued on with his bad boy action. One day in the 7th grade, towards the end of the school year, word went around the school grounds that Eddie Zeno and Lawrence Price were going to fight. And they were going to fight because Eddie called Lawrence the N-word too. And Lawrence told him, that's a fighting word. Meet me after school. And so we all gathered around over near the custodian's shed, away from the main school building. And Eddie was there, stripped to his waist. He's shadow boxing. And Lawrence walks up and sees him and he laughs. And Lawrence lets out a roar. Roar! And lowers his right shoulder and bull rushes him like Big Daddy Liscombe on the Baltimore Colts and tackles him and knocks him to the ground, and he straddles him. And he starts beating him left and right in his head. And he's telling him, say uncle with each blow. Say uncle. And uncle is the equivalent of I quit, no mas, I throw in the towel. But there was no quitting for Eddie. He's a tough little kid. And just when Lawrence was about to lay another left hand hook on him, Eddie whips a knife out of his pocket, a switchblade nonetheless, and he clicks it, and that click got everybody's attention, and he thrust that knife in Lawrence Prince's belly 3 times. Boom, boom, boom. And he kicks Lawrence off of him. And Lawrence rolls over, Eddie jumps up and runs out of the schoolyard shirtless. And we look in shock and horror as the blood starts oozing out of Lawrence. And Lawrence is on the ground moaning and groaning and writhing. Some kids run hither and yon. Some run to the main school to tell the principal. The custodian hears what's happening. He runs out of his shed, sees, comes back with some towels and starts pressing on Lawrence's stomach. And within minutes, the fire department is there, the ambulance is there, and they cart Lawrence off with the knife still stuck in his belly. We're stunned. I walk off with Isaac to our respective corners to sell newspapers, but we don't say a word. We'll look at each other and then look away. We don't know if Lawrence is dead or alive. We just are shocked. So I get to my corner, I sell newspapers, I don't shout out extra, extra, and then I walk home. And I think, just like that, if I had gone after Eddie Zeno and fought him in the middle of that street, he could have stabbed me. That could have been me. And that sent shivers down my spine. So I get home, I tell my parents what happened. My mother is in shock. My father said, them bad boys, you stay away from them kind of boys. They're gonna end up in juvenile hall and then in San Quentin. You keep your nose clean, son, and keep selling them papers. My mother told me to get ready for bed, go do my homework, get down on my knees and pray that Lawrence Price will be all right. I did that. Then I got in bed, but I couldn't sleep. Sleep would not come. And I thought, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna write Miss Owens a note. And I got up out of my bed, got my notebook and my pad, and I wrote her a letter. Dear Ms. Owens, Eddie Zeno stabbed Lawrence Price in the stomach 3 times. They took him to San Francisco General Hospital. When they took him away, the knife was still in his stomach. I hope he has thick skin. Sincerely, Ben.
Wow. Thank you so much, Brother Ben. Thank you, Terry, for your moving stories. What a perfect way to start off the evening, just going back to our childhood. And as Ben said at the beginning of his story, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Let's hope that we are moving in a good direction. Gentlemen, I just want to thank you for just giving us so much to ponder and think about and experience through your eyes. I also want to remind you that we are opening up at the end of the last two stories for any questions that you might have of Terry or Ben or the next two storytellers that you're about to hear. So please keep that in mind. Go ahead and put it in the Zoom if you're in the backstage or on YouTube in the live chat. So we have two more storytellers that I'd like to introduce to you. I don't know them as well as I've got a chance to know Terry and Ben, but I have got a chance to meet these two wonderful ladies and as we're preparing for the show and a preview of their stories. And I think you're really in for a treat. Out of the two storytellers that you're going to hear is Holly Robinson and Linda Brown. Now, let me tell you about Holly. She has been telling stories for over 18 years, both nationally and internationally. Really well-known and well-renowned storyteller. And she is not only just a mother of four, but she's a mother of four storytellers. And so that's a story in itself. And so I'd like you to please get ready to hear her stories in just a moment, but I also want to introduce the partner that she paired with, and that's Linda Brown. She's a professional storyteller. She's been telling stories for over 20 years. And in addition to that, she is the founder or one of the founders of the Black Storytellers of San Diego. And if you'd like to hear more about that and learn more about what Linda has done, please visit storytellersofsandiego.org. They could put it in the chat, or you just remember storytellersofsandiego.org. And the first of those storytellers that we're going to hear from is Holly Robinson. Let's hear from her. Take it away.
I'm going to unmute myself. Thanks so much, Kirk. Definitely have all the feels, as my teenage daughter would say, being with you wonderful people tonight. My mom, when I was little, she used to say in a very thumper voice, if you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all. And then she'd wiggle her nose, because that was one of her talents, but it's not mine. That's how I was raised. But you treat everybody the way you want to be treated. I was 2 years old, though I don't remember this, but I was 2 years old when my parents and I moved from Utah to New Mexico, to a little town, Grants, New Mexico, where my mom had grown up. We moved into a small brown stucco house on the edge of a new development with beautiful Mount Taylor at our back. And there were times, my mom said, that she could take me and my siblings, as I got a little bit older, to the park there in Grants, New Mexico. It was near the Navajo reservation. And so there were lots of people that weren't the same color of skin as me. And she said that she could take us to the park, but she had no worry. She would never lose her little blonde-haired children, because often we were the only ones. She could always tell where we were. And they don't have so many of them now, but I loved the merry-go-round. I can remember climbing onto that merry-go-round and grabbing a pole and holding on for dear life as the older kids ran round and round, pushing us as fast as they could. And I have this image of my little white hands surrounded by little brown hands, and it was all the same to me. And we all looked the same once the merry-go-round stopped and we staggered off and tried to hold on to our lunch. I remember when I was in kindergarten, super excited to go to school. I had new clothes, but they were clothes that my mom made. She made most of my clothes because we didn't have money to buy all the nice fancy clothes that some of the kids wore. And I had a hand-me-down backpack with my supplies in it. And I headed off to school. It was Mount Taylor Elementary School, and there were lots of white kids and lots of Native American kids. But what I remember was that some of the kids, when they walked into the classroom without a backpack, they were handed a brand new backpack with all their school supplies in it. Some of them even got My Little Pony backpacks. I wanted a My Little Pony backpack, but I just had my plain hand-me-down one. I wanted to be like the Native American kids so I could get a new backpack. And my mom, she explained to me that some of those families couldn't afford to provide all those things for their kids, and so the school helped out. And in my mind, I connected poor and Native American. I remember when I was in 3rd grade, we were all sitting there in our classroom doing our schoolwork. Can you picture a classroom of like 25 studious children all looking at their schoolwork doing it? That's how I imagine it. But an aide came to the door and she started calling out names. Jessica, Benali, Jerry, Curly, and kids started walking out of the room. And I asked my neighbor, I said, where are they going? And she said, oh, well, they're going to the Native American field trip. They're going to Uncle Cliff's amusement park in Albuquerque. I think I went to Uncle Cliff's amusement park maybe once or twice in my life. I really wanted to go to Uncle Cliff's. I didn't quite understand why they got to go because they had brown skin and I didn't get to go. But I got to see another side of things also. My family were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and one of my dad's responsibilities was to drive out onto the reservation and visit the small congregations there on the reservation, and our whole family would go. Sometimes I would even give a talk or sing with my siblings. I remember driving in our yellow station wagon down the dirt roads towards the small church houses and seeing the homes that looked so different than my house that I lived in just a few miles away. On the reservation, sometimes the homes were made out of like mud huts, the round hogan huts. They looked really cool for maybe camping, but I couldn't imagine living in them. Or there were some small trailers, and I was very surprised to see that people could live so differently, so very, very close to me. And when we would get to church, there on the front pew would be the Native American grandmothers. They were dressed in their velvet blouses and their velvet tiered skirts. And their hair was pulled up in a very fancy twist wrapped in yarn. And they had huge turquoise necklaces hanging from their necks. And their family gathered around them. And I would look at those women with lines on their faces that, you know, they had earned from lots and lots of long life. And even though they did not look like any glamorous pictures in any glamour magazines that I saw in the supermarket, as I saw those women sitting so proudly with their family around them, they looked very, very wondrous to my young eyes. We moved away from New Mexico shortly thereafter, and I was in Nevada for a few years and didn't think about these differences for a while. And then we moved back to the Four Corners area, Farmington, just before high school. And one of my favorite memories of my entire life, actually, was when I was cast in a summer stock theater musical production in Farmington, New Mexico, called Anasazi, the Ancient Ones. And you can imagine from the color of my skin that I did not play a lead role in this production. I was one of the token white settlers in a few of the scenes, but it was a summer to dream about forever. I loved being on stage 4 nights a week, telling this beautiful story of this Native American girl who was raised by a pioneer family and then got to go be reunited with her Navajo grandmother, as her grandmother would tell her these stories of their ancestors, the Anasazi. Every night I would be there in front of the mirror, putting on my eyeliner and dark lipstick, and down the row of this long row of mirrors, there would be other actors getting ready. Many, many Native American actors that I would love to see their long, beautiful hair in braids and them putting on their traditional clothing. And there were a few white men who would put on brown makeup to portray the Native Americans on horseback, because not everyone could ride their horses. I loved my part in this story, but it was a very sad and hard story to tell, because the backdrop was the Trail of Tears. And I could watch, I would play my part, dancing and singing in one of the hoedown scenes. And then the second act, I could go behind the audience and watch the play happening, unfolding before my eyes. The backdrop of the stage was a sandstone bluff, and the Native Americans would stand on that bluff in their beautiful Native attire and sing their songs with sign language and just fill the whole sky with their culture and the beauty of their language. And then I would watch as the white men would come in and tell these people that they had to leave their home. And it was a play, but it hit close to home, because there on the stage were some of my best friends, Alana and Jerry and Sam. I watched as their characters were pushed off the stage, and the Native Americans formed this long line along the cliff, representing the Trail of Tears as they were sent from their homes. And I wondered how could this atrocity happen in this country that I live in this country that I love? But I never knew quite what to do about it, other than to love my friends, no matter what color of skin they had. In this pandemic time, I'm now homeschooling my children. And this week, in our history lesson, I was sitting with my son, my 11-year-old son, and I had my niece and nephew on Zoom, and I was reading to them, and we were reading about the Trail of Tears and the atrocities that happened. And I was reading this to them, and the book was full of such really, really good questions, like, could this land have been shared? Was there another way to do it? And I asked them. We didn't have any really, really good answers. The kids, when they were asked if the Native Americans should have had to share their homes, of course they said no. And when I think about my mom saying of, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Well, she didn't say anything about the hard things. There are a lot of hard things that we need to talk about, because that's the only way. We got to talk through the hard things so that we can keep doing the nice things, so that my children can hopefully see an even brighter future than we have. I'm going to turn the time over to Linda to share some of her childhood memories.
Hello. My family moved from Pensacola, Florida to Woodlawn Park, which is in Chula Vista, when I was 2 years old. We, my mom, my dad, and my two sisters and I moved into a 2-bedroom house where my parents rented it for $12 a month. But the best part of that house was the people across the street. Their last name was Aquino. The mother was Mexican and the father was Filipino. They had 3 children, and we became instant friends because there weren't any other children around. And we lived at each other's houses, and we loved each other's foods. And that's how I learn about someone's culture, by sharing a meal. When I was in kindergarten at John J. Montgomery Elementary School, parents were encouraged to open bank accounts for their children, and this was done through the school. We were encouraged to open those accounts, and apparently my mother forgot to sign the card for me to open mine. And my teacher sent a note home saying, "Dear Mrs. McFarland, the bank requires the parent's signature on the card enclosed in the envelope. If you will fill out the card and the yellow deposit slip and send it with Linda next Thursday, we will send it to the bank with the bank employee when they come to school on that day. I would be happy to sign the card, but the bank insists that it be signed by the child's parent. Sincerely, Mrs. Harmstead." Of course, my mother signed the card, and we began depositing my pennies in the bank, which made me very happy. My parents would make sure that all of us were involved in school activities, especially since this was a part of the war effort. The next week, while we were playing during recess, I made my friend Salvador mad by getting him out during a kickball game, and when we were lining up to go back inside, he called me a nigger, which made me so mad, I slapped him as hard as I could. Our teacher told me to apologize to him, and of course I didn't. So our teacher sent a note home to my mom asking her to come to school because she needed to talk to her about my behavior. My mother took off work early the very next day and came to class to talk to the teacher. My mother was well aware of what had happened because the incident had been the topic of conversation at the dinner table that evening. When the teacher told my mother her version of what had happened, my mother asked her what was the name that Salvador called me. And she would not continue the conversation until the teacher finally told her. Well, the teacher looked down at the floor and very quietly said, "He called her a nigger." At that point, my mother slowly took my hand and said in her quietest, most forceful voice, through gritted teeth, "No, she will not apologize. In fact, he should." And out the door we went. My sisters and I were taught we had 2 strikes against us. 1, we were Black. 2, we were women. But we could do anything and achieve anything as long as we worked hard, got an education, and didn't allow anyone, regardless of color, to take advantage of us. We were also taught to be careful when we were out, especially around white people. But all Black people weren't good either, so treat all people like you would like to be treated. The next week was Christmas programs. I wanted to be an angel. But after rehearsal, the teacher who was directing the play took me aside and very quietly said, "I'm sorry, but you can't be an angel because angels have blonde hair and blue eyes. But you have a beautiful voice. Why don't you sing in the choir?" Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, for the Bible tells me so. Dear Mrs. Brown, Linda has seemed a little upset lately. She is usually very helpful, but during the past 2 weeks, she has been pouting much of the time and has not wanted to play in our games or do what the rest of the class is doing. Have you any suggestions as to what might be causing this, or how we can help Linda to want to work with the class? We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. When I was in the 3rd grade, I joined the Girl Scouts. Of course, I was the only Black girl in the troop. The other troop members were Japanese, Mexican, French, Italian, Guamanian, and Irish. We met after school at my friend Faye's house. She was the troop leader, and she was Irish. We had lots of fun. We earned our badges and prepared to go to camp at Girl Scouts during the summer. We were only going to stay over the weekend. And then the plans changed. We decided to camp out at the troop leader's farm. We still had a good time, even though it rained and we had to move into the house. About 4 years ago, another one of my kindergarten friends, Lorraine, and my 2 great-grandchildren and I drove to Arizona to visit Faye. And while we were there, Faye told us why our plans were changed for camping out at Girl Scouts. It was because Girl Scouts had told our troop leader that as long as I was a member of the troop, we could not camp at Girl Scout headquarters. On Saturday in Chula Vista, all of the kids, regardless of color, would go to the Vogue Theater in downtown Chula Vista to see the latest chapter of The Lone Ranger and Tonto, Al Lash LaRue, Bugs Bunny cartoons, and eat as much junk food as you could afford. It was one of those childhood traditions that all children should be able to experience. At the end of the day, the lights would be turned on and we would all file outside to meet waiting parents or ride our bikes home or just walk home just a few blocks away. That was a lot of fun. But one Saturday, my father decided to take us into San Diego to go to a movie that he wanted to see. When he went to the ticket window to pay, he was told he had to go around back, walk up the stairs, and sit in the balcony to see the movie. Well, we didn't go to the movie that day. In fact, we did something even better. We went to the Big Apple Cafe. It was special because the owner was my uncle's girlfriend, and we got the royal treatment whenever we went there to eat. She didn't seat us up front. She sat us right next to the kitchen door. And whenever she came out of that kitchen, she would sit a plate of food on our table. She was a great cook and seemed to know without us even ordering what we wanted. She served the best fried fish, potato salad, sweet potatoes, collard greens, cornbread, and iced tea in my world. And oh, yeah, the dessert was to die for. We had pound cake and homemade vanilla ice cream. Now, that was a whole lot better than any movie. When I entered junior high school, we had to go to school in the city, and that was Chula Vista. At that time, it was considered where the upper class lived. My mother worked for several white families there. My mother was a day worker, which meant she cleaned other people's houses. She would always tell us, whatever I do for those children and their families, I'll do for you. Not only was junior high a new experience for me, once again, I was the only Black child there, or so it seemed. And one day, while we were outside during lunch, I remember the twins, two white boys, decided to pick on me. And just as I turned around to say something, one of my friends from John J. Montgomery Elementary School told them to leave me alone. That made my junior high time a whole lot better. When I was 26 years old, I married and had my first child at 30. My John J. Montgomery Elementary School friends held a baby shower for me, and one of my teachers who lived in the area attended. I still live in the same area where I grew up, and my children grew up here also, mainly because I wanted them to have that same feeling of neighborhood safety that I had. They still have friends from kindergarten and high school, and most of their friends remember Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Because we were softball and little league coaches, I was a Brownie and a Girl Scout leader, a PTA officer, and a room mother at Roar Elementary School, where my children attended. Their friends all came to the many birthday parties that were held at my house because of the 10 children who were raised there. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you so much, Holly. Just great two bookends for our to end our evening. Just so powerful. I want to thank you both. And there's something just so raw and powerful about seeing life through the eyes of a child, so unapologetic. There is no way that we can lecture it away or explain it away or give statistics to make it some picture that is not. It is just their raw, black and white perspective of the world. And I think there's such value in seeing things through those eyes of a child. And so we want to thank all of our storytellers, Linda and Holly and Ben and Terry. And what we're going to do now, if there are any questions, if you haven't already, go ahead and put them either in the chat link in Zoom or in YouTube. And we're going to bring the storytellers back as you see them trickling back on the screen. And they're going to get to answer some of your questions. And so what I'd like to do is I have one that I really have been wondering myself, want to know your experience in this. And just to let you know, I'm one of the, down the road, I'm one of the storytellers. So I'm paired with someone that I had not met before, of a different culture and different background and different experience. And I know we all have different experiences in this approach and this process. So I'd like to hear from each of you. If you could, just, we don't have a lot of time, but just a minute or so of what it was like, that paired experience, and just what was your experience with it? What was your approach? and what did you get out of it? If you could just share, each of you or any of you, don't feel obligated, but I just love to hear how your experience went with this process.
Well, I'll start. It was really great being paired with Terry because we were both two city kids who had roots to the South. And it was really good for me to hear from someone who's white and who knew about the racism, and to hear that he had the kind of parents that wouldn't tolerate that kind of stuff. And I never knew coming up that there were white folks like that. And having grown up over the years, I realized the difference. But it was really good to bring my childhood self back there and see Terry as a kid as well. So I think that really rounded out my childhood for me.
Thank you, Ben.
My experience working with Ben was just delightful because he and I have sort of been passing each other, and we were in a play together at one time, but we didn't really ever sit down and really communicate with each other or bond with each other. But this experience of working with him truly bonded a friendship that I intend to nurture and hang on to as strongly as I can. And what was neat about this was that Ben, along the way, taught me a lesson about racism, something that I had overlooked and thought was just perfectly fine and never even saw what it could mean to somebody of color. It was okay to me. And then he really beautifully and graciously explained to me, how would you feel if you were in the other position of that happening to you? And I just cherished that. I cherished that experience, and there's always time to learn, even for an old fart like me.
Thank you, Terry.
I can speak for myself, very intrigued and excited about this project, but wondering if my story had any validity or even if my experience had validity, because I was raised in New Mexico that didn't have, so my interaction was a little bit different. And I really appreciated working with Linda and her validating my viewpoints, but more than anything, just like listening to her and being able to experience her experiences through her eyes, just as many of you had. It was really eye-opening, and I cherished that.
Thank you.
Well, in working with Holly, it was like working with a good friend. It was just, we sat down, we talked, and that's just exactly what it was. Just two friends coming together. Even though we've never touched each other, we've been able to touch each other on screen. And it was absolutely wonderful just sitting and talking to her. And sometimes when I would say things, it was funny to see how wide her eyes would open with I don't know whether that was disbelief or, oh my God, but sometimes it was just really funny. But I thoroughly enjoyed. I was glad that I was able to do it because I have always been when my husband and I got married and we were working with kids with baseball and we had softball, we had little league, we had kids at the rec center and swimming every summer. And he would always look at me and say, how come we're the only Black folks everywhere we go? And I would say, this is where I live and this is what I'm used to. So he became used to it also. But it's just my life.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to just kind of hear how the process was and how it affected each of you a little bit differently. And some things were very similar. We do have some questions coming in. And this is a really interesting one that I love to hear. Again, don't feel obligated to answer, but if there is something that you feel you could share on this one, would love to hear your thoughts on it. So this is from someone in the gallery, from Claire. It says, to all the storytellers, I love the use of the first person voice, right? And the amount of dialogue that you all worked into your stories, which I did too. I thought that was really great and made the stories come alive. How did you go about doing that? Like, one of the questions were those lines the actual dialogue, or did you kind of make it up from what you remembered, right? Or was it actually what they said verbatim? And there might be different answers for each of you, but share a little bit about that process and if you could address that question.
Well, for me, it was relatively easy because the story that I told, I drew, it's an excerpt from my book. And I happened to work with Trina Cleveland, who's in the audience. And it was pretty much what I remember verbatim, and it was actual dialogue. And of course, I had to gussy it up a little bit, but I had the convenience of drawing from a written version of the story.
For me, with some of the notes that I like, the notes that I read about my mother coming to school, and also the part about Linda is not the way she used to be. Those were notes that I found going through some things. So they were the actual words of my teacher. And that's, in fact, finding that is what made me write the story.
As for
Sure, go ahead, Terry.
the words, and I got to bear in mind that I was between 7 and probably 10 years old throughout the course of that story, maybe into my teens. But that's the way I kind of remember it. And I do remember Alan's voice being just this amazing sound. And, you know, I had a lot of other interactions with him that I would love to have worked into the story, but it would have made it too long. But I also was very fortunate to have a father who was, as I said, an opera singer, and he was able to speak about 5 languages fluently and knowledge of 2 other ones, because as being trained as an opera singer, he had to know those languages. And he had a great ear for sound and language, and I picked that up from him. So I love the opportunity to work dialects and dialogue into stories that I tell.
Well done, well done. I didn't want to overlook, Holly, if you had one, but don't feel obligated if you didn't.
Oh, I'm fine.
Okay.
I kind of, you guys covered it.
And Ben, you mentioned Trina. That question was from Trina. I think Claire just forwarded it to us. So I want to make sure we thank you, Trina, for asking that really good question. So another question that I think is a really good one here. What storytellers almost always work in isolation. We work on our stuff, figure our stuff out. Was it was it hard to break that tradition and work together? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
I am not a very good isolation worker. I definitely spend a lot of times in my head, I guess, but I am not one that's very good at vocalizing without an audience and someone to tell to. So I have lots of story buddies that I reach out and share with. So having Linda as a story buddy was just like one more plus.
Right.
For me, I'm a very outgoing person as well. And I had the opportunity and the privilege to be part of Stagebridge in Oakland. It's a senior acting performing arts group. And we have classes and we run our stories past each other, and we have critical friends and they give us feedback. And so I don't feel at all like working in isolation. And in fact, that's where I met Terry. And also acting helps as well.
I am an isolation worker. I sit on my bed and I just write. Whatever comes into my head, I write. I don't worry about spelling, punctuation, any of that stuff. It just comes out. And then I go back and I read it again. And that's where I put in my punctuation and that kind of stuff. And then I usually, when my husband was alive, he was my person who I ran to. And so, but he is no longer here. So now my children have to listen to my stories once I finally get them to where I want them to be. And they have become they're a really good audience, and they're very truthful. Mom, I didn't like that. What the heck did you mean by that? So that's kind of the way it works for me.
For myself, I start in isolation and write. And then my wife, Ann, got me sort of involved in storytelling when I first came up here. She was working at taking classes at Stagebridge, and she's also a docent storyteller at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And so I've got a really great sounding board. When I finally get my piece to the point when she says to me, "Are you ready?" I say, "Not quite yet, not quite yet." And then I finally get it to the point where I want to run it by her. And that's when I get that great feedback of, and we feed off of each other that way. When she tells, I work with her and give positive critiques, and she gives positive critiques to me and suggestions. And I love doing that with Ben on this story, on this whole project, which I really feel a passion for.
So yeah, I'm glad that it sounded like that worked out for all of you, even though storytellers perform, by themselves. There's a lot of collaboration. It sounds like that lended itself well to this project. And I want to make sure I mention, Ben mentioned it, and I think Terry did as well. I kind of alluded to it at the beginning, but I want to make sure I give a clear shout out, especially for those that may not be familiar with it, to Stagebridge. And it's stagebridge.org is the address. That's where I met Ben and Terry. That's how I know them. It is it's an organization that provides classes in the performing arts for seniors. I have taught there in the past. They brought me back as a guest to teach a class now. Donna Washington, who was the MC last week, she's teaching there as well. So yeah, look it up, especially if you're not familiar with it. If you're already familiar, then you know how wonderful it is. So we don't have a lot of time, so I want to make sure I jump back into these questions. Let's try to do at least one or two more. Here's one, and they did put that in the thing, stagebridge.org. Here's one I think is really, I'd love to hear from this. I hear about this, if any of you have any thoughts. Often, race relations elicit a tense emotions. Was there any problem or any uncomfortableness, whether it was at the beginning, or did you have to work through anything, or was that something that, was something that you experienced or had to kind of address at some point? Is there, any of you have any thoughts on that?
For me, no. Because Holly and I just started talking and were able to explain to each other exactly how we felt. And I'm one of those people who talk to somebody in line. So, it's just, and so you just kind of talk to people and they begin to get back to you once they realize that you didn't fall off a turnip truck someplace and you're just trying to be friendly. And
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of what happened with Holly and I. We just started talking.
Yeah, with Terry, I kind of knew him, but not personally. But we did run our stories past each other. And at one point, and I haven't mentioned this to Terry, but I want to say, why didn't you tell, or someone in the family tell the grandma that she had black blood running through her veins? I was a little bit disappointed. Now that would have been great retribution.
Well, they didn't want grandma to die right then. That's why they didn't tell her that.
I think that's why my mother didn't tell her. I think she was frightened to death that would happen.
Preserving the elderly.
Stand the idea of a black person to have dinner with, much less having black blood in her vein. I think it would have been great retribution, and I think that's a wonderful part of the story for me. That actually chokes me up a little bit, that he knew what my grandmother was, and he could hear those arguments that were ensuing between mother and daughter, and he never said anything about it, but I think he knew that she was a real sort of closet racist, as it were, I'd call it. That's a good question, though.
Yeah, that was from Andrew. Oh, go ahead, please, Holly.
Well, I was like Linda, I didn't have any apprehension when I was talking with her and sharing. But one thing that was really important for me, I have a dear friend who has Native American blood running in her veins. And I really wanted to share my story that I was crafting with her, to see how she responded to it, and if she felt like I was respecting everything from her culture. And so it was last night I was able to share the story with her, and we both kind of got emotional in sharing this piece that was just really, really tender. And I realized that that, you know, my version, or the things I remember as a child, it's definitely my memories. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to get the conversation flowing. But the hard things, you know, it's so hard to put into words, but just like it's part of her history too. And I was just really grateful that I could talk to her and feel like the words that were coming out of my mouth were something that were respectful for her too.
Thank you, Holly. And I think you mentioned something in your story that I thought was at the end, kind of as an addendum, that I thought was really, really good to think about. Is you mentioned, of course, you know, the saying about if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. But to add to that, there are some times that we have to have those conversations that are not nice. And so that's what we're trying to do here. And I think it's really important to keep that up. And I think this leads to one last question. Thank you, Andrew, for that question. That leads to one last question. I think this is a good one to end the evening on. This is from Kate. It says, it seems that courage was a quality that led each storyteller to push the boundaries. There was a lot of courage in these stories. Did you all sense your own courage in your story experiences, whether that's now as the storyteller or, you know, even back then? You know, how was that? Can you mention, I'm not sure of this last part. Can you mention who asked it? Oh, okay. So I think somebody was asking me a question. So I think I answered that one. But anyway, if you all can speak to that part of it, the courage of it, did you feel that? Did you sense that? Whether tonight or, you know, at the time of your story, if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll go.
Go ahead.
In terms of courage, no, I didn't at the time, and I remember it very clearly because I was 10, 11 years old. I didn't consider myself courageous in the least bit. But I do remember being pissed and disappointed. And I knew I could no longer carry out my duties as a traffic boy. And I had an alternative. I could be a paper boy. But courage, I don't think that was in my head at that time. It was just outrage and being pissed off and having options.
Yeah, see, I agree with you on the being pissed off, because that's normally when I will, you know, you kind of say, okay, it's not worth it. We're going to leave that alone. It's like the thick skin that she said you got to have. And you thought, I don't think so. And so you go with it, you leave it alone. I don't want to start anything. And people keep picking and they keep picking until finally you say, okay, so you really want to see what I look like or how I can act? Here I am. And as my husband used to say, people would tell him, you have a really nice wife. And he would say, just don't piss her off. And and seriously, that's when I'm coming at you, you know, and I'm very quiet with it. My kids will tell everybody, when she gets quiet, she's really mad. Other than that, she's going to be yelling and screaming. But when she's quiet, watch out. And so that's really what brings stuff out. And you begin to say, okay, look, this is not okay. And this is what you got to do to fix it.
I think that courage is often not something that people see in themselves so much. But one thing that I will say, that I'm really grateful to be part of this project, because I've often not known what to do with my voice and with my being pissed off at what's happening in the world. But because of this of this project and this concert that I was preparing for, in the last few weeks, I have found myself being willing to open up and talk about these hard things and have conversations with friends and strangers that I maybe wouldn't have had otherwise.
So, and one thought on that, kind of to put all this together is, I guess in perspective, a lot of times, just like in history, we look at things as time goes by a little differently. And I think that, that was just a wonderful question, because it was courageous. Each of you had these moments, whether it was you yourself or someone in the story, but there was these moments of just courage that if you look at it now, would you have made that same decision, right? I mean, thinking as a logical adult, right? Or looking back at like, I couldn't imagine myself as a little 10, 12-year-old marching past the secretary to the white principal's desk and putting the flag and my things on the table and saying, I quit. I would have been scared to death. But that takes courage. But like Ben said, yeah, it wasn't really courage. I was just mad. I was ticked off. But looking back at it, I think it's really important to frame it in that and look at it what it was. It was anger that drove it, but it was courage. Those are the type of things that righteous indignation will help us lead to the change that we need. And I hope whether it's through a story or a conversation or our own activism, that we continue this route that we have begun. And with that, let's thank the storytellers one more time. Terry, Ben, Linda, Holly, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for your stories. And I'm going to let Claire take us home.
Thank you. And thank you so much. Kirk, you did an excellent job of emceeing and handling all those questions and coming at you from all different sources. So thank you for that. And really, those stories were amazing. I can't wait to watch them all again. Really, really good. Thank you. And I just really want to thank Rick again for putting this on, and the Storytelling Association of California. Without that, we wouldn't be doing this. So, really good job. Thank you. And if you want to go to storysac.org, and then you can see more information. If you're interested in telling a story like this, then you can be part of this project. Go to the Storytelling Association of California website, and you'll see a great big advert for Stories in Living Color. And then you can apply, you can email us. If you need to find out more and you can't find that, then just write to 6feetapartproductions@gmail.com, and we'll put you in touch with Rick and the team. So thank you everyone for listening. For 6 Feet Apart, we've got another 2 shows, just to keep you updated with that. A week on Friday, on the 16th, we've got a spooky evening, a scary tales. We've got Friday Fright Night, and we've got people who've been on the national storytelling stage. We've got Simon Brooks, Heather Forrest, Anne Harding, and Donna Washington. They're all going to tell really spooky stories. And if you want to be in our audience, you can dress up and we're going to spotlight some of the best outfits, and you're going to win a prize. So come to that. That's on our 6 Feet Apart website, and also on our Facebook page. And then we're doing something quite exciting. On the 30th of October, we're going to do a live show that's also online. So it's like a hybrid. So it's a socially distanced book launch for a friend of mine, for Unnatural Resources, which is a novel all about a story in Congo. And she's been a few times, and it's based on, real life events, but it's a novel. It's quite a hard book, but it's fabulously written and quite uplifting by the end of it. And so that's going to be on the 30th of April. That's in Fairfax, California, if you want to go live, or you can just watch it online. So that's another one. So those 2 things are happening. But anyway, I just thoroughly thank all our storytellers and Kirk for a fantastic job of emceeing, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.
Six feet apart, 6 feet apart. It's the newest thing to do. Stay 6 feet apart, 6 feet apart. The distance between me and you. 6 feet apart, 6 feet apart. And when I say I'll keep you very close to my heart, it's purely metaphorical. These times are quite historical. So step aside, let's live our lives 6 feet apart.